You know, there is a specific kind of silence you only earn after 50 years on this planet. A silence that costs you a bad back, a failed marriage, and 30 years of breathing in drywall dust and sawdust. And I was finally drinking that silence in, sitting on my porch with a cold beer in my hand, watching the way the late afternoon sun hit the maples when the flashing lights tore through my driveway. I didn't get up. I didn't panic. I just took a sip of my lager and watched two officers from the sheriff's department march up my gravel driveway like they were storming a cartel compound, hands hovering near their belts, faces set in that grim, practiced seriousness that rookie cops learn from watching too many movies. One of them, a young guy with a haircut high and tight enough to bounce a quarter off of, barked at me to step away from the structure, accusing me of trespassing on Oak Ridge Heights property, and I just looked at him, looked at my boots resting on the cedar planks I had nailed down with my own two hands, and I asked him if he usually accused people of trespassing on the house they pay the mortgage on. Before the poor kid could process the logic of that, she appeared, marching out from behind the cruiser like a general inspecting the front lines, wearing yoga pants that cost more than my truck's transmission and a scowl that could curdle milk from 50 yards away. Her name was Brenda, the president of the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association, a woman whose entire existence seemed fueled by white wine and the desperate need to control things she didn't own, and she pointed a manicured finger at me and screamed, "Arrest him. He doesn't own this land anymore." I didn't know it then, sitting there with my heart hammering a slow, angry rhythm against my ribs, but that moment was the beginning of the most ridiculous, high-stakes war of my life, a war over 4 acres of trees, a dirt trail, and the absolute audacity of suburban entitlement. To understand why I didn't just roll over, you have to understand what this land meant to me, because after my divorce from Sarah 3 years ago, after the lawyers carved up our bank accounts and the silence in my old house got too loud to bear, I bought this plot of land behind a line of ancient oaks to find the only thing I had left to look for: peace. I built this place myself, not with a crew, not with some fancy contractor who charges you for consultation hours, but with my own tools, my own sweat, and the remaining strength of a body that had spent decades in construction, staining every board of this porch until it felt like an extension of my own soul. For a while, it was paradise, just me and the wind and the smell of the lake drifting up through the woods, until the erosion started, not of the soil, but of my boundaries, starting with a simple dirt trail that cut across the back south corner of my property, leading down to the water. At first, I didn't mind, because I'm not a monster, and seeing kids ride their bikes or neighbors walking their dogs didn't bother me, because I figured we're all just trying to get through the day. But then the disrespect started creeping in, slow and ugly, like mold in a basement. It started with a soda can here, a wrapper there, but the day I found a dirty diaper rolled up and stuffed into the hollow of one of my maple trees, something in me snapped, because there is a line between sharing your land and being treated like a public landfill. I cleaned it up, gritting my teeth, but a few days later I heard that sharp, arrogant laughter that only teenage boys with too much allowance money can produce, and I walked down there to find 3 of them, led by a kid with shaggy blonde hair and sneakers that looked like spaceships, throwing beer cans into my brush like they were practicing for the major leagues. I walked up to them, keeping my hands in my pockets, voice low and steady, and told them to pick it up because they were on private property, but the blonde kid, Tyler, just sneered at me with that terrifying confidence of a child who has never been told no in his entire life, and told me to relax because everyone uses this trail. When I mentioned filing a report for vandalism, Tyler actually laughed, looked me dead in the eye, and dropped the bomb that explained everything. "My mom runs the HOA, so we're allowed to be here," dragging out the words like he was flashing a badge. I told him that he was only allowed to be here if I said so, and after a tense staring contest where he realized that my construction-hardened stare was a lot heavier than his suburban angst, they picked up the trash and left, but as he walked away, he tossed a threat over his shoulder. "We'll see about this." And I should have known that he wasn't speaking for himself. He was speaking for the empire. That evening, the banging on my door wasn't a request, it was an assault, and when I opened it, Brenda was standing there, vibrating with rage, accusing me of threatening her angel of a son, planting her foot on my welcome mat like she was claiming the land for the Queen of England. She didn't ask what happened, she didn't care about the beer cans or the trespassing. She only cared that I had bruised the ego of her offspring. And when I calmly explained that her boys were littering on my deeded land, she hit me with the sentence that would become the centerpiece of this entire nightmare. This trail has been used by Oak Ridge Heights for 20 years. It is practically public access, and we have rights. I tried to tell her that practically isn't a legal term, but she stepped closer, invading my personal space with a cloud of expensive perfume and entitlement, hissing that if I ever spoke to her children again, she would file harassment charges and make sure the HOA dealt with me. I asked her how exactly she planned to deal with a man who wasn't part of her little club, but she just turned around and marched off into the twilight, her ponytail swinging like a pendulum of doom, leaving me standing there with a pit in my stomach, realizing that this wasn't about a trail anymore. It was about power, and Brenda was the kind of woman who would burn down a forest just to prove she owned the matches. The escalation didn't happen with a bang. It happened with the passive-aggressive precision of a psychological operation, starting the very next morning when I walked out to my porch and saw a single, crushed beer can placed perfectly in the center of the path, directly beneath the polite, private property sign I had nailed to a tree. It was a message, clear as day, a middle finger made of aluminum. And over the next 48 hours, the trash multiplied, appearing in neat little piles right at the property line, wrappers and bottles arranged like a shrine to disrespect, and amidst the footprints of sneakers, I saw larger prints, adult prints, suggesting that Brenda wasn't just sending her soldiers, she was inspecting the battlefield herself. I realized then that politeness was a currency these people didn't accept, so I went to my shed, mixed a bag of heavy-duty concrete, grabbed a galvanized steel post, and installed a new sign, one that didn't say please, but screamed, "No trespassing. Violators prosecuted," cementing it into the earth with the kind of permanence that says I am not moving and neither is this sign. My neighbor, Old Man Miller, a guy who had lived here since before the subdivision was even a blueprint, saw me working and warned me, spitting a sunflower seed into the dirt and telling me that Brenda doesn't back down, she doubles down, and that I was kicking a hornet's nest that had lawyers on retainer. He was right, because 2 days later, I received a letter on thick, creamy stationery from the Oak Ridge Heights Compliance Division, a letter that used words like historical easement and unlawful obstruction, threatening civil action if I didn't remove the barrier within 48 hours, claiming they had uninterrupted use for 2 decades, which was a lie so bold it was almost impressive. I laughed it off, thinking it was a bluff, until the police cruiser rolled up that second time, and the older officer, Sergeant Kowalski, a man with a mustache that looked like it was made of steel wool and a badge that gave him a god complex, stepped onto my porch and threatened to put me in a 24-hour holding cell for disorderly conduct if I didn't open the trail. That was the moment the fear turned into something colder, something harder, because when a man with a gun and a badge tells you that your property rights don't matter because a woman in a tennis skirt made a phone call, you realize that the law isn't always on your side. Sometimes it's just on the side of the loudest voice. I asked Kowalski if he had a warrant or a court order, and he leaned in, invading my space, telling me to be careful because my attitude could be seen as obstruction, and as they drove away, leaving me shaking with adrenaline and rage on my own front steps, I knew I needed to stop reacting and start hunting. I called Mike Reynolds, my lawyer and old drinking buddy, a man who hated bullies more than he hated warm beer, and he told me to stop talking, stop arguing, and start recording, telling me to rig the property with cameras that synced to the cloud because Brenda was going to make a mistake, and I needed to catch it in 4K resolution. I spent the rest of my savings on a security system that could spot a flea on a coyote from 50 yards away, hiding lenses in the trees, angling them at the trail, the driveway, and the porch, turning my peaceful sanctuary into a surveillance state. And then I sat back in the dark, watching the glowing green monitors, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert, and I watched in real time as 2 men in polo shirts embroidered with the Oak Ridge Heights logo walked onto my land carrying a crowbar, looking like the world's most boring hit squad. I didn't run out there. I didn't scream. I just sat on my porch and watched the screen as one of them jammed the crowbar under my concrete-anchored sign, grunting and sweating, while the other one stood lookout, and the audio feed picked up every damning word. Brenda said to just break the damn thing. She's sick of looking at it. The crowbar guy grunted, and his partner laughed, saying, "He ain't gonna do nothing. Brenda runs the HOA. We run the trail." And with a final, sickening crack, they snapped the post I had planted, dragging my property into the woods like it was garbage. I saved the footage, backed it up to 3 different servers, and sent it to Mike, who called me back 30 seconds later sounding like a kid on Christmas morning, telling me to file charges immediately for property destruction, trespassing, and intimidation, and to attach the video where they explicitly named their boss. I went to the courthouse, filed the paperwork, and felt the shift in the air, a heaviness lifting off my shoulders, because they thought they were dealing with an old man they could bully into submission, but they had just handed me the weapon that would end them. The final confrontation played out like a scene from a Western, but instead of tumbleweeds, we had the perfectly manicured lawns of suburbia as the backdrop, and instead of a duel at high noon, it was Brenda leading the police up my driveway at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday, her face set in a mask of triumphant smugness because she thought she was coming to deliver the final blow. I saw them coming on the monitors, Sergeant Kowalski looking annoyed and Officer Davis looking like he wanted to melt into the asphalt, with Brenda strutting in front, clutching her clipboard like a shield, and I walked out to meet them, phone in hand, recording openly, my heart steady and cold. Brenda started talking before they even stopped walking, barking about how I was unlawfully blocking community access and how I had ignored their warnings, and Kowalski chimed in, telling me to take down the barrier or face immediate consequences, completely ignoring the fact that his goons had already torn it down the day before. I let them talk, let them dig the hole deep and wide, and then I calmly asked for their names and badge numbers for the record, a request that made the air go still and dangerous, causing Kowalski to bristle and ask why I was recording, to which I replied that since they had threatened me with unlawful detention last time, I was simply protecting my rights. Brenda laughed, a shrill sound that grated on my nerves, telling me to stop playing games, but I just looked her in the eye and asked, "You mean the sign your maintenance guys tore out with a crowbar yesterday while saying your name on camera?" And watched the color drain from her face faster than water down a drain. She tried to stutter a denial, claiming it was out of context, but I held up the phone, showing the freeze frame of her henchman destroying my property, and told the officers that I had clear video and audio evidence of her ordering the destruction of private property, and that my lawyer already had copies of everything. The shift in power was instantaneous and brutal. Officer Davis looked terrified, Sergeant Kowalski looked like he had just realized he backed the wrong horse, and Brenda looked like a cornered animal, shrinking into herself as I told them that if they wanted to continue this, my next call would be to the state police to report official misconduct and conspiracy. They left in a hurry, tires crunching on gravel, Brenda's SUV trailing the cruiser like a beaten dog, and I stood there feeling the adrenaline crash, thinking it was over, thinking I had just won a skirmish, but I didn't know the war was about to end with a nuclear option until my phone pinged with an email from an anonymous address. The subject line was, "You're not crazy," and the body of the email was from a whistleblower inside the Oak Ridge Heights board, someone who had watched Brenda's reign of terror for too long and had finally decided to burn the kingdom down. She forged everything. The email read, and my breath hitched as I opened the attachments to find PDFs of the historical easement, with pixelated signatures, metadata proving the documents were created only last month, and audio files of Brenda explicitly telling the board that she didn't care about the law, that the land was theirs because she said so. She had forged the deed, forged the maps, and forged the history of the land itself, building a castle of lies on a foundation of arrogance. And in that moment, sitting in my kitchen with the sunlight streaming in, I realized she wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal. I forwarded everything to Mike, who called me back laughing the laugh of a man who was about to buy a new boat with his settlement money, telling me that we were going to file civil suits, criminal referrals, and injunctions that would bury Brenda and the HOA under a mountain of litigation so heavy they'd never crawl out. The ending wasn't a handshake or an apology. It was the silence returning to my woods, a deeper, heavier silence than before, because the trail was empty, the trash was gone, and the knowledge that Brenda was facing fraud charges and a humiliating removal from the board made the air taste sweeter. I walked down to the spot where my sign used to be, touching the broken concrete, and I didn't feel anger anymore, just a profound sense of closure. knowing that in a world that tries to take everything from you piece by piece, sometimes you have to draw a line in the dirt and stand there until the world moves around you. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? If I hadn't had the money for those cameras, if I hadn't known a good lawyer, if I had just been a little more tired or a little less stubborn, would she have won? How many people out there have lost their peace, their land, and their dignity just because someone with a clipboard and a fake badge told them they didn't matter? Justice was served on my porch that day, but it scares the hell out of me to think about how close it came to being just another story of the little guy getting crushed by the machine.